Maine will always be a great state to live. It's beautiful. It's filled with wonderful people. It's just, as every Mainer knows, it is a really special place. It's why more people want to live here.
Greatest place in the world.
But I think that economic value has always been one of our hallmarks until very recently. And all of a sudden, Maine has just gotten so expensive to live. And you see it everywhere.
Yes.
If you're coming from New York, if you're coming from California, Connecticut, Massachusetts, certainly Washington, D.C., the Maryland area, Maine looks like a pretty good deal. Your taxes are lower for everywhere except Massachusetts, unless you're a millionaire, and your cost of living is going to be considerably lower. On the other side of the coin, if you're a Mainer living here, working hard the way you've always done, our state's gotten a lot more expensive. All of a sudden, Maine's gotten to be a worse deal, and I think that's a really unfortunate dynamic.
Yeah.
So the state share of Medicaid has been growing by a rate of 21% since fiscal year 2022, and it grew by that same rate just from fiscal year 24 to 25.
That is a shocking number. 21% annually?
Yep.
Holy moly. For a young guy, Alec, you have been watching Maine for a long time and watching it very, very much up close. Were you in college or just out of college when you first worked for Susan Collins back in, I don't even know what it was?
So I joined Senator Collins' staff right after graduating from Colby. That was back in 2002, and I served on her staff in Washington from then until 2005.
And you've touched Maine in and out. I know you went off to Big Boy Camp and Lehman Brothers and business school and all that. But you were the CFO of the Health and Human Services Agency in Maine. You were the CFO of the state, basically, CFO of University of Southern Maine. I mean, you've been touching Maine. When was your last touch point? USM, when was that? 2000
in 2023.
23, so all the way through. Thank you for your service. That's a lot of leaning in on Maine. So I think we should use this time to talk about the arc of Maine's story. You've witnessed it as in the finance leader's chair from all these dimensions for so long. I look at it and I see a lot of expansion in the budget, and I can't tell where it went. And then you did that wonderful Substack where you studied it. Tell us where the expansion, how much have we expanded if you take out inflation and everything else? What are we really talking about from when you arrived to today? And where did it go?
Sure. So if you look, I joined the LePage administration in 2014. That was the end of Governor LePage's first term. And a lot of the work that Governor LePage and his administration did during that first term was stabilizing the state budget. It's seen a lot of spending expansion kind of from the mid-1990s on. Some stabilizing during the 2000s, but then the Great Recession hit. State lost a lot of revenue. That was when we ran into that period of time where we weren't paying the hospitals. We built up large debt to the hospitals. We were even furloughing state employees at one point. So there were some real challenges when Governor LePage took office in 2011. Just to give you kind of perspective on the budget, I think revenue in 2011 was about $2.9 billion. This year we recorded, or the recently completed fiscal year in June, we recorded $5.7 billion in revenue. And really, when you take out the revenue sharing, which is a negative revenue, and the tax programs that are also negative revenues, is about $6.2 billion. And because that amount's grown so much, it's important to net that out. So you've seen a doubling in state revenue since then. Stepping back to that 2014 period, I think what happened in the second term of Governor LePage's administration was you saw a return to population growth. You saw steady revenue increases. At that point, we'd had one large tax cut and a second one going into effect not long thereafter. And while there was a dip each time in the first fiscal year after the tax cut in revenue, small dip, after that revenue increased considerably. It beat forecasted projections in every revenue forecast from prior to those tax cuts on. So between a stabilizing in state spending during Governor LePage's administration, and then an increase in revenue. That's where you ended when Governor LePage left office in 2019. Since then, what we've had is a really large increase in the state budget. And it happened first on the revenue side. It was followed up on the spending side. So this year, again, we'll have net revenue, or fiscal year 25, about $5.7 billion. We will have spent about $5.5 billion. I haven't seen that final number. The revenue number is final. We won't have a spending number for a bit. But we appropriated a little north of 5.5 billion. So one way that I think is interesting to get perspective on that is that throughout the 2010s, you had 3 billion something for revenue, 3 billion something for spending. It built up through that decade. Transitioning to today, where we're almost 6 billion in revenue and closing in on that in spending, we only had 1 year each with a 4 billion number for revenue and for expenditures. So we surpassed $5 billion in fiscal year 2022. And then that was in revenue. For expenditures, it was in fiscal year 2024. And so you had a ton of revenue growth really coming out of the pandemic. It was, paradoxical, if you will, because everybody thought states struggled so much during the pandemic, but a lot of states actually did quite well, and Maine was one of them. According to the State Economist, a lot of it was just high earners moving to Maine, establishing residency here and paying that. And if you look even at the latest monthly revenue report that was just published for July, the first month of fiscal year 26, you see that withholdings continue to be up. We outpaced revenue by almost 10%. Compared to projections in the first month of the year. So that continues to be strong for Maine. And I think it is just a lot of higher earners having moved here. But the real revenue gains were in that FY20 to FY 2022 period. So real revenue in fiscal year 2022 is actually greater than real revenue in 25. They're both historic highs, but that peak hit in 2022. Then you had the jump.
Are you doing inflation adjusted versus 22 and 25? Is that why you said?
So the number back in 2022 was 5.4 billion as compared to the 5.7 in FY 2025. But if you adjust for inflation, you're up to about 5.8 billion for that FY 2022 year. And obviously, given how much inflation we had in those handful of years around the pandemic, that adjustment becomes pretty important. But we caught up with spending during this last biennium. And now if you look at what's appropriate.
Tell me how did they do that? Where did it go?
A lot of it is main care driven. So, as I looked at the latest post I put up on Substack was just questioning sustainability of our state budget, because you went from a period of high revenue growth to one of high spending growth, where now spending is really caught up and the spending growth rates look considerably higher than the revenue growth rates, even though revenue growth is healthy. So just based on reasonable projections for the current biennium, fiscal year 26, 27, it looks like we're going to have a lot more growth than they've appropriated for. So now stepping back to main care, for example, general fund main care, so the state share of Medicaid has been growing by a rate of 21% since fiscal year 2022. And it grew by that same rate just from fiscal year 24 to 25. So that's a pretty steady rate.
That is a shocking number. 21% annually?
Yep.
I mean, overall medical inflation is in the sixes. How are we more than tripling medical inflation with Medicaid?
Well, it's a good question. So I was surprised that we had so much growth this year. So one way to understand Medicaid growth is if you go back and you look at FY18, so Governor LePage's last full fiscal year in office, we spent, I think the number was 774 million general fund on the main care program. That number this year, FY 2025, was 1.393 billion. So you're close to doubling that. But if you take the number in FY 2021, it was actually 781 million, if I'm not mistaken. So it's almost the same as 18. And the reason for that was during the pandemic, the federal government picked up a larger share of Medicaid costs. It gets a little bit into the weeds, but they call it the FMAP, Federal Matching Assistance Percentage, that each state's got, and each state got a boost. That, and you had utilization at much lower levels. So for several years, the state really wasn't spending compared to historic rates that much. General fund, it's why you had basically the same amount of spending in the late 2010s as you did in the early 2020s. When that federal match went away, you had a natural increase because all of a sudden the state was picking up a larger share of Medicaid, and you had post-pandemic utilization levels. Now, that would explain a large percentage jump, say, from FY 2022 to 2023, 2023, maybe 2024. Doesn't explain the 2024 to 2025. And that I don't know. When you look at some of the line items in what DHHS calls its cycle report, we only get to see those once a year. There's not a ton of reporting out there, but you can see that report publicly. It looks like there are certain lines that have just really exploded in the budget. And I don't know what that's due to. There are a lot of times, especially when I'm writing on Substack or having conversations like these, that I wish I had the insight I used to have when I was, Deputy Commissioner of Finance at HHS.
You cannot. Are there other? So Maine Care, an explosion. You obviously had the inclusion of lots of working employed people in the Medicaid program nationally with Obama. But what else? I mean, you have the drug coverage and the expansion of the what am I thinking of? The GLPs category of drugs. Are there other areas of state budget that have moved a lot as well? Transportation, education, general assistance, welfare, or is it really all just this Maine Care area?
No, I think there are other areas, and I think it's pretty consistent across the board. Transportation is highway funds. That's separate from the general fund, and it is kind of better taken alone. General fund, the reason I always talk in those terms is that whenever you see numbers reported on state government, unless they specify otherwise, or unless lawmakers are talking about something else, they're always talking about the general fund. And the good reason for that is general fund is your tax dollars. So just to put it in perspective, general fund is comprised of, for almost 90% of it, is individual income tax and sales tax, sales and use tax. They make up about 88%, 82% if you factor in, again, revenue sharing, some of the other tax relief programs. Another 7 or 8% of that is corporate income tax. So these are really main tax dollars. And then on the other side of the coin, about 35% of the general fund goes to DHHS, 25% of that being to Maine Care. Another 35% goes to the Department of Education, 25% of that being general purpose aid to local schools, so public education funding specifically.
And has that exploded?
It hasn't exploded, but it's gone up quite a bit. The best way, I think, to understand general purpose aid spending is that if you go back to FY 2018 and compare it to FY 2025, we're spending about 20% more in real dollars per student. You've had quite a bit more spending, and then you've had a decline in enrollment. And when you put the two together, it's 20% more, again, real dollars compared to what we had in the past per student, if you will.
20%, and that's inclusive of the decline in enrollment in these schools. So their fixed cost stays the same. Yeah, fewer kids in the class. Got it.
So, and I think you were asking, kind of other areas of the budget. The non-Maine Care aspect of DHHS and the non-general purpose aspect of the Department of Education, both of which are 10% of the general fund, have grown a lot as well. So if we've had about $2.1 billion in spending growth, so it's about $3.4 billion in FY18, FY 2025 looks like about $5.5 billion. About $1.2 billion of that is Maine Care and general assistance. But then if you add in the non-Maine Care DHHS and the non-general assistance DOE, it's another $500 million. So about $1.6 billion rather of that $2.1 billion is just in those two departments. And you've had a lot of other increases across the board. If you go back and look at DEP's budget in FY18, general fund is about $7 million. I think they've had $21 million appropriated for the current fiscal year. Higher education was $300 million. Now
So
it's about $400
DEP
million.
gets a triple. It's just from a small number, but that's a big expansion.
Small base.
And
Yeah.
it's a bit of a throat choker on home building and other, waiting for the DEP to let you do things or not, or tell you why, and let your number come up. What about courts, defenders, prosecutors, jails? Obviously the jails are at the county level, but you hear a lot about the state letting people go because they can't give them a defender, or they can't give them a jail slot, or they can't give them a court date.
I don't know about that. I mean, you've got a judiciary budget that's about 2% of the general fund. The corrections budget, our prisons are about 5% of the general fund. I think both have grown. My sense, and I don't have those figures committed to memory, but I believe judiciary growth has outpaced inflation and population growth. And I think corrections has been just about on pace with it, if I've got those figures right. But I don't, kind of going back to that first Substack post I wrote, and it's not something I invented, but looks pretty clear to me. I just don't think Maine's problem is the lack of spending anywhere. I mean, we're spending. If you just look at like the way I think is helpful
to numbers. I mean, what's interesting is, let's say we added a judge to push through appeals on housing and, projects. Let's say we added a family judge to push through these complicated cases. Let's say we added 20 defenders that we don't have. Wouldn't move the needle at all on the grand scheme of the size of our expansion. When you're growing Maine Care by 21% a year, which is our largest by what? By 5?
Yeah. And a good way to think about it is just the overall general fund pie. So if you go back as a document I used to use, created when I was at HHS, just to give people perspective as we were developing budgets there, because we would have these year-long budget development processes. And a lot of that was just making sure people understood how our budget worked, what it was comprised of, the dynamics and growth over the years. So in 1986, Maine Care was 8% of the general fund budget. 1994, I think it was about 13%. Today, it's about 25%. Governor LePage's administration, we were closer, getting down to kind of that 22, 21%. So it's 25% and growing now. General purpose aid used to be about 30% of the general fund budget. Now that's coming down, so it's about 25%, matching up with Maine Care. I think for the first time, I believe in Maine's history in this fiscal year, you may see us spend a larger portion of our general fund budget on Maine Care than general purpose aid, which is something I'm not sure people are aware of, but it's a worthy point of discussion. And you went from having about 20% of Mainers on the Maine Care program to 30% post-expansion. You're going to have a fairly large increase in spending. So it's just changed the dynamic of the state budget considerably, because the pie is always 100%. So if once upon a time you were 8%, then you're 14%, and now you're a quarter of that state budget, that's a big change.
Let's just take a quick minute on general purpose aid, and then we'll go to the revenue side. This, when you talk to Mainers now about their tax load, the thing that comes up for them is a spike in their property taxes, in the cost of running their towns. Per pupil, education expenses comes up enormously. And the general assistance goes into those towns. So in a way, the OpEx of the town is the problem of the state, even though you can't control it. All you can do is push back this general assistant. Was there any discussion in LePage of the duplication of work that happens between the town, the state, and the county that could be a reduction in property taxes for people?
I'm sure there was. Those weren't discussions that I don't think I was ever a part of, but I'm sure there were discussions to that end. And there really have been, I think, in every gubernatorial administration in Maine for quite some time, because our property tax burden has been high for so long at this point. One thing that I thought was really telling in Governor Mills' State of the Budget address in January, for example, is she pointed out how much more we're spending both in general purpose aid to our public schools. So that's money that states just transferring to the towns to fund their public schools, and in revenue sharing. So municipal revenue sharing is a program where we send 5% of general fund revenue back to Maine municipalities, and it has to go directly to property tax relief. That's what the design was. So we're spending a lot more in both of those areas, as she pointed out. But then her line in that State of the Budget address was, and now I fervently hope that Maine's towns and cities will find a way to consolidate services, work together, and reduce property tax burden for Mainers. And I quote her loosely there, but that was the message, and the line fervently hope what was actually verbatim. And I think what state government really needs to do, especially with the revenue sharing program, but also thinking about general purpose aid, is put some teeth into that funding
A
to
little bit more
hold
than
the
fervent
towns
hope.
accountable. Yeah,
Maybe,
hope is
maybe
not binding.
fervent action. Yeah. What
Hope is not binding.
I feel this is a big opportunity, unplayed playbook in Maine. This duplication of, every town has a separate police record keeping system. I've spoken to cops. They can't stand all the duplication. And then you still don't know whether someone's just been arrested in the next town over. And then you start again. If you make an arrest, the jail has its own. And the same thing with the town offices, and the same thing with the application for family services support from the feds. Each one seems to have a separate and somewhat bloated subscale process. Can the state put teeth in? Can the state say, you don't get your general assistance, you don't get your rev share unless you adhere to a playbook, a basic playbook of efficiency? And maybe you could throw some sort of non-NIMBY criteria in there. And if the rich town wants to know, I want to have my own special record keeping system, and I want to, be able to NIMBY every cell tower that doesn't go up and whatever, great. But we're going to save money on you as a state, and we won't be so mad at you. Is that allowed?
I think it would be. I would certainly want to talk to expert civil servants, lawyers, so forth, who probably be a little better versed in detail on that than I am. But I usually found that, if you had a thoughtful approach to a reform like that, there was a way to do it. And my experience in state government was there were a ton of great civil servants to work with to do that sort of thing. And I think you'd probably find a lot of municipal leaders who would be interested in working with the state too, as you mentioned about, municipal officials who would prefer consolidation. From the state standpoint, when I think about revenue sharing, for example, I would put some teeth into that program, because right now, what revenue sharing does is it takes 5% of general fund revenue, and then it distributes across the state to municipalities on a formulaic basis, and it has to go to reducing the property tax burden. But if your property tax burden is 40 million or 80 million, it doesn't matter. That 1 million or whatever you get just reduces it. So all it says is it doesn't matter what the number is, you just have to use it for reducing it, since money's fungible and without any other stipulation tied to it. I don't think that has any teeth. So I would look at the towns and say, look, this formula is going to be driven to some degree by how much budget growth you have. So if your budget is well outpacing your town's population growth and inflation, then you're going to start to lose out on revenue sharing dollars. The way the formula works right now, actually kind of in reverse, because 80% is on the formula. The remaining 20%, called revenue sharing 2, goes to towns rather, that have a high tax burden. It's specifically designed for that. And I don't think that's right.
Yeah, there's a tyranny about property taxes in particular, because you got the from away crowd who buy up properties along the coast, drive up property taxes, even though there may be no economic base for the other 9 months of the year in that town. And the correlations don't make sense anymore. Whereas if you did your model, Alec, where you could actually follow their spending efficiency per pupil spending, per resident spending, per covered life spending, you'd have a much better driver. I want to switch to the role of the federal dollar. So you quoted $6.2 billion in the last budget that we have a look at in the biennial. It's actually 12.5 if you include the federal dollars. Was that always true? I saw a giant spike in the size of the wedge that is federal dollars in the Maine budget at about 2020. Can you tell us what's going on with the federal role in the state budget? Because that seems like a very tenuous liability. If the federal government's got $36 trillion in debt, that money may not be there. Where did it come from? What control do we have over it?
Well, so much of it is Maine Care driven because you're getting federal matching funds for the Maine Care program. And that goes back to that federal matching assistance percentage. And that percentage is so important for states across the country. So depending on a state's per capita net income, that state will get from 50% of its Medicaid expenditures up to about 70% of its Medicaid expenditures reimbursed. So the lower you have per capita income, and the way the formula works is an average of 3 trailing years, the higher your matching percentage will be. And you can see it in Maine. And this is where one of the threats exists that you just alluded to. Because our per capita net income in Maine has increased, which is a very good thing. Now, you can talk about where it has in our state and how that's happened. I think that's a different conversation. But net, it has increased. That's reflected in a lower matching percentage. So we used to be in the kind of 2/3 of every Maine Care dollar expended was covered by the federal government. Now it's closer to 3/5. So we dropped from 67. I think the rate this year for FY26 is 61.5. It's in that 61 to 62% range. That is a big change in our state budget. You have, just so things aren't confused, the Medicaid expansion population, which appears to be about 120, 140,000 members on that Maine Care program. They're matched at 90%. So that is different. So you'd have a different blended rate. I don't know that that's published anywhere. The number that's
a
published
very
is
odd
that
idea that people who could actually be employed in the commercial market that are on Medicaid get 90% of their dollars from the federal government, but people who are actually poor and need Medicaid, you get 61.
Yeah, it's something from expansion that never made any sense. It didn't then, it doesn't now, that your core population is being matched at a lower rate, be it, disabled people, the very poor, pregnant women being matched at a lower rate than your expansion population. And the real problem with it isn't just a philosophical one. It's that it's an incentive for a state to cut services for a core population because you're getting a much lower match to it. And that's a big
cut
problem.
Services there and essentially cram back the commercial market on the employed side, because you got employed people where you can get 90% of their money from Washington if you jam the commercial employers and stick people on Medicaid.
Yeah.
Holy moly.
There was a reason the LePage administration so fervently opposed Medicaid expansion. We have it now. Maine voters approved it. So the best thing I think that we can do is operate within that. And I think there are a lot of things that we can do. I think the work requirements are going to help a lot. But the growth we're seeing now just isn't sustainable. And so much, to your question about federal spending, so much of that increased federal share of Maine State's budget comes from that expansion in Medicaid. And it's been a dynamic change, even since I served as finance commissioner in the state's budget.
That's basically Maine is a health plan. If you look at the percentage of dollars, we're a health plan. Do we run it ourselves? Do we actually have claims payers and customer service desks and, the whole deal?
There's a very large Office of Maine Care Services that oversees the Medicaid program, and you're working jointly with the federal government because the federal government has to approve every expenditure. And, it's a little bit more in the weeds with Maine Care, but when I served as finance commissioner at HHS, one of the offices I oversaw was our Office of Program Integrity. And we bulked that office up because it was really important to make sure that we didn't have people who were on Medicaid who weren't actually eligible. We had to make sure, that we didn't have any fraud or abuse, because all of those things, basically the state every month is sending its report down to the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services and saying, this is what we spent. They go through it and they say, yep, okay, we're going to reimburse you at your matching rate for those. If they come across ineligible expenditures, if there's any fraud or abuse or anything like that, they do what's called disallow those payments, and that comes back 100% on the state. And so it's really important that as you're running your Medicaid program, you've got it tightly tied up and well administered.
Did you guys ever look at farming the whole plan off to one of the Medicaid managed care carriers?
Yeah, not when I was there. They did prior to the time I joined DHHS. Commissioner Mary Mayhew at the time spent a lot of time around that. And I think ultimately Mary and her team at the time came to the conclusion that that wasn't the right decision, that we could run the program and administer it ourselves effectively. I don't I don't have any insight on the program now as far as how well run it is. I can just see the growth in spending. And I think a lot of the same people who I worked with when I was at DHHS are probably still, they have a different director of the Office of Maine Care Services, but I bet a lot of the civil servants are the same. And I worked with a ton of great people who worked really hard and I thought did a very good job. So I think Mary's read, at least at the time, was probably right. One thing I can tell you we did very well, and I don't know if they're doing it now, was forecasting the Maine Care program. I think that forecasting is extremely important because it's such a variable aspect of the budget and because it's grown so much. I oversaw that forecast when I was at HHS, and I can tell you the teams that did it did such a good job. And we probably, and I'm going to suggest it in a Substack post soon, but I think we probably need to formalize that forecast and do it the same way we do revenue forecasting. So it's all public, so it's all vetted.
Well, especially if it's a number that's moving at 21% a year in a state that's moving at 2%.
It's a tremendous amount of growth.
So we've described an interesting story. I think there was a revenue vignette that we didn't give enough credit to, which is these sort of affluent Zoom crowd, people who Zoom for work, showing up in Maine because they got untethered from their cities during COVID, and this is the most beautiful place to live. And that's been a revenue bump. Did you get a sense of how much revenue from that crowd?
Hard to say specific to that group because once you're a filer in Maine, you're a filer in Maine. That being said, if you look at general fund revenue, back in FY18. So my last full fiscal year as finance commissioner is about $3.6 billion. This year, about $5.7 billion because the revenue sharing program has grown so much because of tax relief really staying on pace, but also auto sales taxes now act as a negative and go over to the highway department. So you have another about $500 million in revenue that's kind of either a negative above the bottom line or below the bottom line, which means we actually had about $6.2 billion in revenue in FY 2025. So this is a huge amount of growth. In real terms, it amounts to about 25% growth since FY18. It's about 60% dollar for dollar, but about 25% real at a time when state population growth has been about 5.5%. So we've basically grown revenue and then expenditures have caught up with it, both by about 25% real terms, again, at a time when we've had about 5% population growth. So I always use those terms to put it into perspective because it's just been such a large amount of growth. And going back to your question about revenue, when the State Economist was asked about this by the Portland Press Herald back in January, long Press Herald article that I thought was really good, exploring this revenue explosion, what she said was she thought it really was a lot of high earners moving to Maine, filing their taxes here. And again, you have a bit of a paradox where if you're coming from New York, if you're coming from California, Connecticut, Massachusetts, certainly Washington, D.C., the Maryland area, Maine looks like a pretty good deal. Your taxes are lower for everywhere except Massachusetts, unless you're a millionaire. Otherwise, your taxes are going to be lower, and your cost of living is going to be considerably lower. And especially back when this crowd was moving here, real estate was an unbelievable arbitrage opportunity for them. On the other side of the coin, if you're a Mainer living here, working hard the way you've always done, our state's gotten a lot more expensive. Taxes haven't gone down. They've only gone up when you consider property tax burden. And while other states have been cutting income taxes, we have not. So all of a sudden, for Mainers who've just been here working hard, Maine's gotten to be a worse deal. You're looking at places like the Southeast, the West, even the Midwest now that are all cutting taxes, that have lower cost of living. And that's looking more attractive, while you have a very well-heeled crowd from some of the Northeastern, kind of Northeast seaboard states, maybe California as well, looking at Maine and saying, gosh, that's a good deal. And I think that's a really unfortunate dynamic. I mean, we want Maine to be a
That's a
great deal
recipe
for
for
everybody.
poison, isn't it? If
I think
there's
so.
only 3 or 4 places that are more expensive than Maine, but if you draw people from those, you not only sort of make it tougher for I mean, depending on what you do with the budget, if you use that extra money to make the place more lean, then you could actually be making a win for middle class and working class Mainers. But otherwise, you accelerate the toilet flush, because you now chase them out to lower cost of living and lower tax states at the same time.
No, I think you're right. And I think Maine, I think we really need to look at economic value in our state. Maine will always be a great state to live. It's beautiful. It's filled with wonderful people. It's just, as every Mainer knows, it is a really special
Greatest
place. That's
place
why
in the
more
world.
people want to live here. But I think that economic value has always been one of our hallmarks until very recently. And all of a sudden, Maine has just gotten so expensive to live. And you see it everywhere. You know, real estate is obviously the highlight line, but there's plenty of others. And we need to get to a place where people aren't looking at the Southeast and the Midwest and some of those Western states and saying, gosh, I wish I could stay in Maine, but it's such a better deal in North Carolina and Georgia, or in Ohio and Indiana, or in Colorado even. I mean, Idaho. All of these states offer, I think, better economic value right now. And that's really unfortunate. I think there's a lot of things our state government can do with so much more revenue at our disposal. I think some different decision making, some different policies could change that pretty dramatically.
Let's talk about that. When you do the Alec analysis of all 50 states, we are 18th in terms of our economic performance, but we are 45th in terms of our economic outlook. Looking forward, people with a choice, somewhere to go. You mentioned the few states that maybe we're a good place to go to. And of course, we have the magic of who we are and where we are. But what would you do? We're going to have a new governor not that long, about a year away. What would you do to reverse the swirl that you just described? What are the first couple of moves that a new governor, a new administration, a new, lease on life for Maine would do first?
And this is probably just because of it's a lot of the work that I've done in the past, but I would take a good look at our state budget. For one thing, I think right now we're on an unsustainable path. If you look at growth and appropriations for the current biennium, the rates of growth for fiscal year 26 and 27, general fund, 5.3% and then 0.7% in FY 2027. Those rates are well below the growth.
That's make believe if you're growing your healthcare at 21.
Yeah, overall general fund growth for the past 3 years has averaged 11.6%. From FY 18 to 25, it was 7%. So those are annual rates. And that makes me look at our general fund appropriations for the current biennium and say, we're going to pass these considerably. On the other side of the coin, because our revenue picture is so good and continues to outpace the revenue forecast, it did both in June and in July. So we had more revenue in fiscal year 2025 than we expected. We've started fiscal year 2026 with more revenue than we expected as well. That's a good thing you have going for you. I also think there's quite a bit of flexibility in our state budget. We're carrying larger balances, I think, than we should be. I think there's probably an opportunity to take a really good, call it forensic analysis of our state budget and deappropriate certain accounts that are carrying balances every year. They never spend down, reappropriate those to other areas to bring our state budget back into sustainability. Once you do that,
I think
there's some
this
other
is like
things
the rainy day fund kind of thing.
No, so not even. So this is interesting. And I wrote a Substack post about growth in state cash balances. So the state cash pool in fiscal year 2018 was about $1.2 billion. Today, it's about $3.6 billion. That's down from an average over the past several years of about $4 billion. Growth in that part of it has been the rainy day fund. So the budget stabilization fund is actually a general fund account, and it sits in the treasurer's cash pool. It was about $273 million in FY18. It's $1.03 billion today. Finished the last fiscal year with $950 million. But if you look at that treasurer's cash pool, there in that general fund account, you had $1.5 billion. So you've got another, works out to about $580 million of non-budget stabilization fund, general fund dollars that are sitting in a cash pool. A lot of that is funds that are carried. So they don't lapse, they carry from one year to the next. I think you got to take a good look at the general fund budget and see, are the same dollars carrying from one year to the next? Are they just consistently over appropriated? I think there's probably an opportunity to be a lot more efficient. I think our variances are probably about twice as high as they need to be. So there's a lot you can do.
Is that big fat cash account, is that enough to run an aggressive experiment with cutting taxes? Say, hey, we know we'll get some revenue growth here. Let's burn down our cash account by recruiting new business. And maybe we don't need, maybe the cash is still there because you can grow revenue by cutting taxes if enough people come and enough businesses grow. Is that cash available for a tax cut revenue growth trial?
Here's how I would put it. I think it's the right way to think, but I would consider it just a little bit differently. So if I step back to our budget right now and the lack of sustainability, I think you've got to get it back to sustainable levels. So you want to be growing, by no more than Maine population growth plus inflation. And I think there's a lot of things we can do within the general fund budget to get there. Once you do that, then I think there are opportunities to cut taxes based on several things. One of them was your point about economic growth. So when Governor LePage cut taxes twice during the last biennium, or during the last decade rather, both times we ended up with more revenue. There was a one-year dip following the tax cut, not as large as forecasted to be, and then it bounced back to higher levels. So you ended up, starting the 2010s with about $2.9 billion in general fund revenue, ended in 2018 with $3.7 billion in general fund revenue. Now we're to almost $6 billion a year in general fund revenue. I think you've got bandwidth right there. The other thing, though, and this is to your point, Jonathan, if you look at that budget stabilization fund that's now more than $1 billion, by statute, the budget stabilization fund exists to supplant a revenue shortfall. Or supplement it rather. If your revenue comes up short, you can go to your budget stabilization fund and you fill it. It doesn't say how. People usually think about it in terms of revenue shortfalls based on fewer tax payments in an economic downturn. But there's no reason why you can't use that as insurance against tax reduction. And when you couple that with the fact that we actually grew revenue after reducing taxes in the prior decade, I think you've got a real winner. I think once you stabilize the general fund budget, I think there's an opportunity to reduce taxes considerably in Maine. And I think it's going to do a lot, not only to boost, as you were talking about, economic growth, job creation, all the things we associate with a more competitive tax environment. And we're seeing other states across the country flatten their tax rates, cut them significantly while Maine doesn't. It makes us less competitive. But there's another aspect that I think people overlook, and it goes to the cost of living and the cost of doing business in Maine. The cost of government is an important component of both of those things. Taxes are a big part of the cost of government. And I think with the cost of living having increased in Maine so much, the cost of running a small business, anything you can do to put more money in people's, you name it.
Alec Porteous, lifelong Maine advocate, from college student to campaign activist to legislative aide to CFO of the health system to CFO of the state. Thank you for shaping up our understanding of our exploding budget and things we might do to bring it back around. And thank you for doing it all on Maine for Keeps. Thanks for tuning in to Maine for Keeps. I hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to follow us on social media, click and share with your friends, or get on to mainforkeeps.com. If you have ideas for new content or podcast guests, or if you'd like to give us some money to support the effort, be sure to click and send. We're at team@mainforkeeps.com, and I'm at jb@mainforkeeps.com. Thanks. See you soon.